Somewhere in Nevada, a man serving a sentence for a crime nobody in Colorado had ever heard of sat down for a routine blood draw. He didn't know it yet, but that single needle was about to reach back 34 years and pull his name out of a house he thought he'd left buried in the snow. This is the story of a family that did everything right. Locked their doors, loved their kids, built a life in a neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen. And it wasn't enough, because the man who came for them wasn't looking for a reason. He was looking for an opening. And across 12 days in January of 1984, he found 4 of them. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a killer this violent, this methodical, could walk free through half a dozen more attacks before anyone connected the dots. Why his own trial nearly collapsed decades later over a room full of fingerprints that didn't match him, and what it finally took to drag a name out of the dark and put it in front of 2 separate juries. Aurora, Colorado, early January 1984. A new suburb on the eastern edge of Denver, built fast and built for families trying to outrun something. Overcrowded cities. Bad memories. A childhood they wanted better for their own kids. Streets of near-identical houses, chain-link fences, basketball hoops bolted over garage doors. Everyone waved. Almost nobody locked anything they didn't have to. Bruce Bennett was 27, a Navy veteran, disciplined, quiet, the kind of man who studied at the kitchen table after his daughters were asleep, working toward a career as an air traffic controller. His wife, Deborah, was 26, warmer, quicker to laugh, the one who actually ran the household underneath Bruce's spreadsheets and study guides. They'd met through Deborah's brother, the way people meet in a city small enough that everyone is 2 introductions away from everyone else. They had 2 girls. Melissa was 7, just 2 days from turning 8. Vanessa was 3, too young yet to have opinions about much of anything, but never far from wherever her older sister happened to be. A year earlier, Bruce and Deborah had scraped together a down payment and bought their first house together, on a quiet street called East Center Drive. It was, by every visible measure, a family arriving at the life they'd been working toward. And somewhere out there, completely unknown to them, something had already started hunting. Here's what almost nobody in Aurora knew yet, and what should unsettle you the longer you sit with it. The Bennetts were not the first house this happened to. They weren't even the third. On the night of January 4th, a married couple named Jim and Kim woke up to find a stranger standing over their bed. He beat them both with a hammer before fleeing into the dark. They survived, though neither one ever fully described the rest of that night the same way twice. Outside, near the driveway, Kim's purse turned up, rummaged through, and discarded, its contents scattered across the ground like he'd gone looking for something and abandoned the search halfway through. Whatever this was actually about, it clearly wasn't about money. 6 days later, on January 10th, a 50-year-old interior decorator named Patricia Smith was attacked in broad daylight, in the middle of eating lunch inside her own townhome. She shared that home with her daughter and grandchildren, 3 generations under one roof. She was beaten with a hammer, struck an estimated 17 times to the head, and sexually assaulted. Like at the first scene, her purse had been gone through and left scattered nearby. The hammer itself was left behind at the scene, discarded like it no longer mattered once the job was done. Her daughter found her hours later, in a home that until that afternoon had never once felt like anywhere in particular to be afraid. That same day, in a different corner of Aurora, a woman named Donna Home came home from grocery shopping and was ambushed the instant she stepped into her own garage. She was struck with a hammer and sexually assaulted, left with what her boyfriend would later describe, when he found her, as a severe wound to her head. She survived, but she woke up having to relearn things most adults never think twice about. Which utensil was a fork? What a knife on a table was actually for? Pieces of her own competence, gone overnight, and never fully returned. 3 attacks, 12 days. One pattern nobody had connected yet, because in 1984 there was no shared database, no easy mechanism for one department to know what another was quietly sitting on. Just paper files, phone calls that may or may not have happened, and a man moving faster than anyone could track him. But that's not even the worst part. Because the pattern wasn't just repeating, it was escalating. Each attack across those 12 days grew more violent than the one before it. A trajectory that was always going to end somewhere. And on the night of January 15th, it did. The Bennett's garage door, like a lot of garage doors on a lot of quiet streets that winter, had a habit nobody thought twice about. It didn't always get closed at night. Sometimes it stayed up, forgotten in the shuffle of dinner, bath time, homework, one more small task that lost out every time to something louder and closer at hand. Sunday, January 15th, was an entirely ordinary evening. Dinner at the table, dishes left for morning, a bath for Vanessa, Melissa negotiating unsuccessfully for 10 more minutes before lights out, the same negotiation she ran most nights and lost most nights. Nobody was thinking about a garage door at all. Sometime after the house went quiet, someone walked in through that open garage. No forced entry anywhere else. There didn't need to be. What happened next, investigators would only fully reconstruct years later, piecing it together from blood spatter, a broken staircase railing, and a body found near the bottom of the stairs. Bruce woke to some sound in his own house that didn't belong there, and he went to investigate it, the way a lot of fathers would. He met the intruder near the top of the staircase. There was a struggle violent enough that both men tumbled down the stairs together, snapping several of the wooden spindles along the railing on the way down. Bruce lost. He was beaten with the hammer, and then, in the kitchen, the attacker picked up a butcher knife from Bruce's own kitchen drawer and used it on him before moving further into the house. Deborah was found in the bedroom, badly beaten. In the room the girls shared, Melissa had been killed and sexually assaulted 2 days before what should have been her 8th birthday. 3-year-old Vanessa was found alive. Barely. A firefighter located her in the wreckage of that bedroom, and she was rushed by ambulance to Children's Hospital in Denver with injuries severe enough that doctors were candid with the family about how unlikely her survival really was. Severe head trauma, a shattered jaw, multiple fractures. She went into surgery that morning not expected to make it through the day. She did. Through emergency surgery, through weeks in a coma nobody could promise would end well, through a recovery measured 1 day at a time for longer than anyone standing in that waiting room wanted to sit with. Monday morning, Bruce's mother, Connie, couldn't reach the house by phone. She tried once, then again, then a third time, while past the point where everyone's still asleep stopped being a reasonable explanation. She drove over, let herself in with her own key when nobody answered the door, and found what would define the rest of her life. Aurora Police Detective Steve Connor was among the first officers to respond, with no way of knowing yet that this case would occupy the next 3 decades of his career. Patrols sealed the block. Technicians walked the house room by room, photographing and bagging evidence that would matter far more decades later than anyone processing it that morning could possibly have guessed. The murder weapon, the hammer, was nowhere on scene. Whoever did this took it with him. Outside near the garage, boot prints sat pressed into fresh snow, leading away from the property and going cold about as fast as the physical trail itself did. Neighbors were canvassed up and down the block. Nobody had heard anything. Nobody had seen a car that didn't belong. That's often how these nights work. The absence of anything unusual becomes the only clue anyone is left to offer. Word moved through Aurora fast. A family killed inside their own home. A 3-year-old, the only one left who might know anything, and far too young and far too injured to tell investigators a single useful thing. A tip line filled with calls that led nowhere, strangers reporting suspicious neighbors, delivery drivers, ex-boyfriends, anyone who fit the shape of a fear this size. None of it pointed anywhere real. The funeral for Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa drew a room that filled past capacity, colleagues, neighbors, people who'd only ever met the family in passing at the grocery store, all showing up because a case like this makes strangers feel like they owe something to people they never actually knew. There was no suspect, no motive that made sense on its own, just a growing evidence box, a case number added to a stack of unsolved files, and a house on East Center Drive that people on the street started quietly avoiding after dark. And here's where things take a dark turn, because the story doesn't stop in Colorado. 11 days after the Bennett murders, hundreds of miles away in Kingman, Arizona, a man named Roy Williams was attacked in his own bed, struck with a 25-pound piece of granite. Somehow he survived. A patrol officer noticed footprints outside the house that matched a pair of shoes worn by a young drifter picking up construction work nearby. That drifter was arrested. 23 years old. Records would later show he'd obtained a Colorado driver's license the previous summer. proof he wasn't just passing through the Denver area, but living inside it, working alongside people who had no idea what else he might be doing with his evenings. His name was Alex Christopher Ewing. For one brief moment, this could have ended right there. It didn't. Nobody in Arizona had any reason to connect a construction worker in custody for one assault to a triple murder and 2 additional attacks in a state he'd only just left. And it wasn't the first time Ewing had moved through the country, leaving a trail nobody managed to connect. Court records would eventually show prior arrests tied to him in Florida and California, states with no reason in 1984 to compare notes with a small Arizona jail or a suburban Colorado police department. There was no national criminal database that could flag a man arrested in one state as someone worth a second look in 3 others. A person could simply relocate, and in relocating, become someone else's problem entirely or nobody's problem at all. Aurora police, Lakewood police, and authorities in Arizona were, at this exact moment, each holding a piece of what was clearly one continuous case, sitting in 3 entirely separate filing systems with no real mechanism to talk to each other. There was no shared regional database yet, no easy way for a detective in Aurora to know what a detective 4 states away was looking at. Ewing sat in a jail cell, and the Colorado file sat open, and the 2 facts never touched. Because of overcrowding at the jail in Kingman, Ewing was transferred to a detention facility in St. George, Utah, to await his Arizona court date. He told investigators they're an unverifiable story about hitchhiking out of Colorado in the cab of a trucker's rig. Nobody had any reason yet to ask him a single question about Aurora or Lakewood or a family on East Center Drive. On August 9, 1984, deputies loaded Ewing into a transport van to move him from Utah back to Arizona for a scheduled hearing. Somewhere along the route, they stopped in Henderson, Nevada, so the deputies and their prisoners could use a bathroom. Ewing escaped. That same night, he broke into a nearby home and attacked a married couple, Nancy and Chris, in their bedroom with an axe handle, beating them both severely while their 2 young sons slept, unharmed, in other rooms of the house. He didn't get far. He was arrested 2 days later by park rangers patrolling the area around Lake Mead, still carrying almost nothing, having spent 48 hours as close to genuinely free as he would ever be again. A Nevada jury found him guilty of escape and the axe handle assault. The sentence, 110 years. Long enough that the pending Arizona case over the attack on Roy Williams was quietly dismissed altogether. Ewing disappeared into the Nevada prison system. And for years, nobody outside a small circle of Colorado investigators had any reason to think about him at all. While Ewing served out that sentence, the Bennett and Smith families kept living without an answer. DNA testing barely existed as an investigative tool in 1984. What would eventually crack this case open was still, at that point, mostly theoretical, confined to academic papers rather than crime labs. Even by the early 2000s, matching DNA between 2 different scenes was becoming possible. But there was still no equivalent of a fingerprint database, nothing that could take an unknown genetic profile and turn it into an actual name. Then, in 2002, forensic analysts at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation made a quiet but significant breakthrough, the kind that comes from painstaking lab work rather than a single dramatic discovery. DNA recovered from both the Bennett scene and the Smith scene belonged to one person. 2 attacks, 6 days apart, finally confirmed as the work of the same man. In practice, this changed almost nothing. There was still no name attached to the profile. A DNA profile without a corresponding sample to compare it against is functionally just an extremely precise description of a stranger. 11 more years passed this way. Detective Connor, older now, kept the file open on his own initiative more than on any department mandate, a habit that outlasted several changes in leadership above him. By 2016, he'd tell a local reporter that the case had never really gone on the shelf, that someone at the department had always kept poking at it, because of exactly how horrific it had been. For Connor personally, it had stopped being just another open file years earlier. It had become something closer to an obsession. That same year, Aurora police tried something new. They partnered with a Virginia lab called Parabon Nanolabs, using a process called DNA phenotyping, marketed under the name Snapshot, that claims to predict physical traits directly from an unknown genetic sample. Skin tone, eye color, hair color, ancestry, even, with an assumed baseline age, a rough approximation of facial structure. Investigators fed in the DNA recovered from the Bennett scene decades earlier and got back two computer-generated faces, one showing what their suspect might have looked like at 25, the age they believed him to be in 1984, and a second, artificially aged forward to approximate what he might look like as an older man in the present day. The lab's own scientists were careful to caveat the results. A DNA composite is a scientific approximation, not a photograph, and things like smoking, weight, and sun exposure can reshape a face in ways no gene sequence predicts. Detectives released both images to the public anyway, hoping somebody, somewhere, would recognize a stranger in a face built out of genetic code instead of a photograph. The tips rolled in. 40, maybe 50 of them, by Connor's own count. Every single one went nowhere. Reporters at the time even raised, then set aside, a wilder theory. Could the same unidentified DNA profile somehow connect to Colorado's most famous unsolved case, the killing of JonBenet Ramsey? It never did. No connection between the two was ever established, and investigators were clear that it was speculation, not evidence. But it tells you something about how desperate this case had become for a break of any kind that reporters were reaching for anything, including cases with no real link at all. The truth was almost cruel in its simplicity. Somewhere out there, the actual man in that composite image was already sitting in a database, in a Nevada prison cell, with a name, a booking number, and a decades-old conviction. He simply hadn't been tested yet. The technology pointing an entire police department toward his face was, in a sense, staring at the answer already. It just didn't know it yet. What his persistence still lacked was a legal mechanism, something that would force a comparison between what detectives already had and the one man who could match it. In 2013, one finally showed up. Nevada began requiring convicted felons already in its custody to submit DNA samples going forward, part of a broader national push toward retroactive DNA collection inside state prison systems. 3 years after that, in 2016, Nevada's Attorney General extended the requirement retroactively, reaching back into the state's prison population to test men convicted decades earlier, long before DNA testing existed as a working investigative tool for the crimes that had put them there in the first place. It was a bureaucratic, unglamorous policy change, the kind that never makes a headline of its own. It turned out to be the single most consequential thing anyone did in this entire 36-year case. Ewing, still serving his sentence for the Henderson attack, was tested along with everyone else already inside. One more swab in a state-mandated backlog, no different in that moment from any of the others being processed alongside his. The match against the Bennett and Smith DNA profile came back within a single day of his sample entering the national system. 34 years of nothing. And then, overnight, everything. Before any of this reached the public, Aurora detectives did something they'd never had reason to do before. They quietly called the surviving victims and family members from across these different attacks, people who'd never met each other, who'd spent decades assuming their cases were separate tragedies, and asked them to come into police headquarters. There, they were told investigators had identified a possible suspect, though testing was still being finalized. One woman who'd survived one of the January attacks later described the moment the department reached back out to her after all those years as dredging up memories she'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. For people who had built entire adult lives around a single unanswered question, even a possible suspect was enough to unravel a night they thought they'd finally packed away. Colorado investigators then traveled to Nevada in the summer of 2018 to interview Ewing directly. When they showed him a photograph taken at Patricia Smith's murder scene, he visibly recoiled. Told that his DNA had been matched to physical evidence recovered from both crime scenes, he offered them exactly one line in response. "There's got to be a mistake." Across 2 separate interviews, he acknowledged living in the Denver area in 1984, working construction and plumbing jobs around the metro, but provided no explanation for how his DNA could possibly have ended up at either scene. It was a strange, almost anticlimactic moment for a case this large. 34 years of searching, ending not in a confession, but in a shrug. Colorado issued an arrest warrant listing 13 separate counts, including 6 charges of first-degree murder, 2 for each victim, 1 alleging deliberation, the other alleging the killings occurred during a separate felony, plus attempted murder for the attack on Vanessa, sexual assault charges tied to both girls, burglary, and a handful of sentencing enhancers. A man already decades into a Nevada sentence for an axe-handle attack was now formally wanted for a triple murder he'd never once been charged with. Then came delay after delay, as Ewing's legal team filed motion after motion attempting to block his transfer to Colorado. For nearly 20 months, they fought it, moving the case from Nevada's own courts up through federal appeals all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which ultimately declined to intervene, closing off the last option available to him. In late February 2020, Ewing was flown to Colorado aboard a state aircraft, landing at Centennial Airport in the early afternoon, and was driven directly to the Arapahoe County Detention Center to be held without bail. Days later, at his first court appearance, he stood in a red jail jumpsuit and orange sandals, a chain running from his handcuffs down to his ankle shackles, answering the judge's routine questions the same quiet way each time. Outside the courthouse, word reached the Bennett family that after 36 years, there was finally a face and a name attached to the file that had outlived most of the detectives who'd first opened it. For Connie, now well into her 80s, it was the first time in decades she'd been able to picture the person responsible as something other than a shape in the snow outside a garage. The DNA is what got Alex Ewing into that courtroom. But it would not be the only thing this case ultimately came down to. The trial opened in Arapahoe County in the summer of 2021, in front of a courtroom that for the first time in 37 years had an actual face in the defendant's chair instead of an empty case file. Prosecutors, led by District Attorney John Kellner, called 25 witnesses. Jurors were deliberately kept from learning that Ewing had also been charged separately in Patricia Smith's murder, so the panel could weigh the Bennett case entirely on its own evidence. The most consequential witness was Yvonne Woods, a DNA analyst with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, who told the jury that genetic material recovered from a bedroom comforter, tested once in 2001 and again in 2018, matched Ewing on both occasions, extracted specifically from sperm found on the carpeting beneath Melissa's body and on the comforter that had partially covered her. Woods left the jury with a number to sit with. The odds this DNA belonged to anyone else on Earth, roughly 1 in 3 nonillion. A 13 followed by 30 zeros. A figure so far beyond ordinary human intuition that Woods spent part of her testimony simply explaining what it meant to be that certain about anything at all. Weeks of testimony. Dozens of exhibits. A jury asked to hold 37 years of evidence handling in their heads at once. Then the defense, led by attorney Stephen McCrowan, presented its case, and the trial stopped feeling like a formality. A fingerprint examiner testified that of 31 prints recovered from inside the Bennett home, not one of them belonged to Alex Ewing. The defense argued that the original 1984 investigators had handled key evidence without gloves, and that 37 years of storage, transfers, and retesting left real room for contamination. At one point during the trial, the defense formally moved for a mistrial over exactly how some of that evidence had been handled over the decades. For a genuine stretch of this trial, there was an open question in the room that had nothing to do with theater. Did a number like 1 in 3 nonillion outweigh a crime scene with no physical trace of the accused anywhere inside it? In closing arguments, prosecutors walked the jury back through the math one more time. A number so large it stops functioning like a number and starts functioning like a wall. The defense, in its own closing, asked jurors to sit with the absence just as seriously as the presence. 31 fingerprints, and not one of them his. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury had its answer. On August 6, 2021, Alex Ewing was convicted on every count in the Bennett murders. 11 days later, at sentencing, Judge Darren Vall told him that over a 12-day span in January of 1984, he had inflicted what the judge called an unspeakable orgy of violence, and that his actions were an abomination. Before handing down the sentence, the judge heard from the family. Connie Bennett spoke first, addressing the court rather than the man who'd killed her son's family, saying she wouldn't call him an animal because animals still have a purpose in this world. She described the moment Vanessa started first grade, when a teacher noticed the scars on her face and asked what had happened to her. The little girl answered plainly, "Someone came and killed her mom and dad and tried to murder her too." She wasn't wrong. Then Vanessa spoke. 41 years old by then, flown in from Arizona, carrying the aftermath of that night in ways that never fully went away. Severe head trauma that left lasting cognitive effects and partial paralysis on one side of her body, decades of depression, anxiety, and anger, and a 2-decade struggle with heroin addiction that she said she'd only recently gotten sober from. She told the court that what she lost that night went well beyond her parents and her sister. She said she lost her trust in people, her dignity, the person she was supposed to become. At one point, she broke down entirely before composing herself enough to keep going, telling the judge, simply, that she'd lost her sanity too. The judge handed down 3 consecutive life sentences, enough under the law as it stood in 1984 to guarantee Ewing would die in custody. But Colorado wasn't finished with him yet. The following spring, a second trial opened in Jefferson County for the murder of Patricia Smith, in front of a different jury of 9 women and 3 men. The same core tension resurfaced. The case again centered almost entirely on DNA, semen recovered from Smith's body, the carpet beneath her, and the blanket that had covered her. The defense again raised doubts rooted in decades of evidence handling from an era before DNA testing existed as a working tool for the investigators who first processed that scene. During proceedings, Ewing addressed the court directly and unprompted, insisting the system was rigged against him, claiming he'd tried to point investigators toward other suspects only to be dismissed every time he raised it. It was the same posture he'd held since his very first interview with Colorado investigators years earlier. Not a confession, not a denial that quite held together, just a running insistence that the story everyone else was telling wasn't the whole one. The jury didn't buy it. Ewing was convicted of first-degree murder in Patricia Smith's death. In a statement afterward, the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office said their thoughts remained with Smith's family as they finally saw justice, more than 3 decades after her murder. Donna Home, the woman attacked in her own garage 6 days before the Bennetts, showed up to watch the closing arguments in Ewing's Bennett trial, even though her own case never resulted in a separate criminal charge tied specifically to her attack. Her husband, Ron, who found her bleeding that day with a severe wound to her head, has talked about the years it took her to relearn things most people never think about twice. What to do with a knife and a fork. How to trust a stranger standing behind her in her own driveway. Somewhere in that quiet Aurora neighborhood, the house on East Center Drive is still standing. A garage door left open one January night in 1984 was the only thing separating 5 ordinary lives from a stranger who was counting on exactly that kind of carelessness. It wasn't really a lesson about garage doors. It was a lesson about how much of what protects us was never built to withstand someone looking specifically for the one night it fails. Patricia Smith's case sat unsolved for 38 years before a policy change nobody was watching finally cracked it open, a routine prison intake procedure that had nothing to do with her case at all until, suddenly, it had everything to do with it. That raises a question worth sitting with. How many other cases like hers are still out there right now, waiting on one overdue sample, in one overcrowded prison system, to finally walk through the door? And Vanessa Bennett, the 3-year-old who was never supposed to survive that night, is in her 40s now, living under a married name, carrying a lifetime of physical and emotional damage that a courtroom verdict could acknowledge but never fully repair. She built an actual life around all of it anyway. One the worst night of 1984 doesn't get to define completely, even if it never fully lets go either. If this one stayed with you, that's exactly the point. Subscribe, tell us where you're watching from, and let us know which moment hit hardest. See you in the next one.